I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome Anthony Kronman to Baylor and to welcome back Andrew Delbanco to Baylor, who's been here before. We're delighted to have both of them here. They were assigned a question, unlike most of the presentations for this weekend's conference. They were actually assigned a question, and I was talking with Andy at dinner about what he would say, and I asked him, well, are you going to talk about your book? He said, no, I think I'm going to talk about the question that was assigned to me. So, I was sufficiently humbled by that response, and glad to hear that he was taking seriously our assignment. And that question is, does wisdom have a role in the 21st century university? The procedure for tonight will be that Tony Kronman will speak first, and then Andy Delbanco will speak after that. And then we'll have questions. There are microphones on both sides here. And we would like questions, not speeches, from the audience. So if you prefatory remarks are okay, but we do want to hear mainly from our two speakers, and indeed very distinguished speakers. Anthony Kronman is the Sterling Professor of Law and former Dean at Yale Law School. He's currently visiting professor at NYU, where he is teaching philosophy to undergraduates in the philosophy department and teaching philosophy to law students in the law school. He's become a full-time philosopher now, I think, and we've all profited from especially his recent book. He's written a number of books. He's written a book called The Lost Lawyer, the Failing Ideals of the Legal Profession. He's written a textbook on contracts, cases, and materials. He's written a book on Max Weber, but the main reason that he's here with us tonight for this conference is the book which many of us at Baylor have read and many of us have discussed together, the book Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. And that book also contains his own reflection, not just on how we might recover the centrality of that question for the humanities and for the university, but also his reflection on teaching, especially since he stepped down as dean of the law school, in Yale's directed studies program, a sort of core primary text option for incoming freshmen, first-year students at Yale. A wonderful reflection on the fruitfulness of that program in the lives of faculty and of students. So we're delighted to have him with us tonight. Andrew Delbanco, as I say, we're happy to have back. He's the director of American Studies at Columbia and the author of many books, including The Death of Satan, Required Reading: Why Our American Classics Matter Now, and The Real American Dream. And all of those books were named notable books by the editors of the New York Times Book Review. The Puritan Ordeal won the Lionel Trilling Award from Columbia University. He also is a regular essayist, and many of us have read him in a number of venues, including the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, and the New York Times Magazine. I love to find his reviews in the New York Review of Books, where he's frequently assigned to take on 6, 7, or 8 of the latest books in higher education. And I always feel like I know which ones I need to read after that and which ones I can happily avoid purchasing or even reading. In 2001, he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and named by Time magazine as America's best social critic. In 2003, he was named New York State Scholar of the Year by the New York Council for the Humanities. His book, Melville: His World and Work, was published in 2005 in both America and in Britain. That book was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize in Biography and appeared on numerous best books lists of that year. It was awarded the Lionel Trilling Award by Columbia University and has been translated into German and Spanish. 2 upcoming things to look for from him: The Abolitionist Imagination will be published by Harvard University Press, and the book that comes closest to our topic tonight and which many of us have been waiting to see, College: What it Was, Is, and Should Be, will appear from Princeton in spring of 2012. So join me in welcoming them, and then they will speak one after the other, and then we'll take questions. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Tom. My thanks also to Darren Davis and the other organizers of this extraordinary conference for the invitation to join you this evening and to have a chance to be a part of a really remarkable gathering. I told Darren a couple of weeks ago after receiving the program for the conference that this actually was one of those rare conferences that I would actually like to be at from start to finish. It doesn't happen very often, but starting with Wendell Berry and on to Kierkegaard and Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, a feast without end. And I'm really grateful to you for the time and energy and thought that you've put into this gathering, and again, thanks for including me in it. Can we educate for wisdom in the modern university? The answer seems obvious. Wisdom is perennial. So long as there are universities, there will be room in them for wisdom. That was true in Paris in the 13th century. It's true at Baylor today. But if the answer were as simple as that, I doubt we would all be here tonight. This conference is a response, in part at least, to the growing concern that there may not be, after all, much of a place for wisdom in our universities today. Why should that be? Today, a university is, above all, an institution devoted to research. Most universities, of course, do many other things, but the central and defining task of the modern university is to provide an organized setting for the advancement of knowledge. This is its raison d'etre, one that extends to every discipline, including the humanities. It governs the selection of faculty, arrangement of departments, organization of curriculum, and much else besides. Everything that is most distinctive about the modern university is determined by its commitment to the research ideal. Stated in the simplest terms, this ideal joins two beliefs. The first is that the subject matter of every discipline is always capable of being better understood than it is at present. There is no end to how far our knowledge of it can go. The second is that no scholar or even generation of scholars can ever glimpse more than a fragment of this knowledge, which accumulates over time through the successive efforts of countless researchers, each of whom adds a small bit to the collective achievements of those in his or her field, superseding the work of those who went before and expecting to be superseded in turn. I can now reformulate my question more precisely. Why should the research ideal, defined as I have, make anyone doubt that the teaching of wisdom has a place in our universities today? To answer this question, to begin even to think about this question, one needs a working definition of wisdom. I take mine from Aristotle, whose discussion of the subject has had a lasting influence on Western thought. Aristotle distinguishes two sorts of wisdom. One he calls theoretical, and the other practical. The first has to do with those things that cannot, in his words, be other than they are. The truths of mathematics are things of this sort, but they are neither the most real nor important ones. The order of the world, of the real world, from the circling stars above to the mud beneath our feet, is a thing of this kind as well. It, too, is something that cannot be other than it is. It is necessary and hence eternal, since what exists by necessity must remain forever unchanged. The study of this order is what Aristotle calls physics, and in its highest reaches, metaphysics. The philosopher seeks to grasp it in thought, and when he succeeds in doing so, becomes, for a time, the god of the world on which his mind is eagerly trained. Nothing can possibly be more gratifying than the attainment of such wisdom. It is the highest goal at which any human being can aim. Practical wisdom has a different sphere of application. It is what we need to deliberate well and to make sound choices in the field of action amidst a tumult of contingencies where things can always be other than they are. It is a kind of discernment which enables the man or woman who possesses it to see what courage, generosity, justice, and the like require in any particular case. All of this is, of course, well known. That's a line that I could not deliver to most audiences, but to you, I am completely confident that I can say it without a minute's worry that you know exactly what I mean. All of this is, of course, well known. What I want to emphasize now are two other features of Aristotle's account of the nature of wisdom. One concerns the perfectibility of theoretical wisdom. The other has to do with the fact that practical wisdom cannot be taught. Both are explained by the distinction between form and matter, a metaphysical distinction that Aristotle takes for granted in each of his inquiries. Everything is a composite of form and matter. This is easy to see in the case of artifacts whose form and matter are at first separate, then brought together by an artificer, a cobbler, for example, or a poet. But natural things are composites too. They have form and matter as well. The form of a plant or animal is what makes it the sort of thing it is, a starfish, rather than an oyster or a clam. And its matter makes it an individual member of its kind, this starfish, rather than that one. Only one aspect or dimension of this composite is intelligible, however. All that we can ever know about a thing, anything, natural or artificial, is its form. This is true whether we are talking about leather, nails, and glue, or the shoe the cobbler has made, or about organisms, organs, and the materials of which organs are composed. At every level of inquiry, we encounter the same basic distinction between form and matter, and all that we can ever understand at any level is the form of the thing we are studying. Its matter, and therefore its individuality, is ultimately shapeless, and therefore literally incomprehensible. No assumption lies more deeply at the core of Aristotle's thought. Aristotle's world has an inherent order or form. It is a cosmos in which everything has its proper place. It is therefore inherently, and one might add eternally, intelligible. But it is not completely intelligible, since the world contains matter as well as form. The materiality of the world renders it only partly penetrable by mind, whether ours or anyone else's. Still, everything that is intelligible in the world can be grasped by the human mind without remainder. If we study the world with sufficient care and patience, we can understand the forms of things. And because there is nothing more to be understood about them, it is possible to acquire a knowledge of the world that is as perfect as any knowledge can be. though as mortals with needs, we cannot hold on to this knowledge forever. But in those contemplative moments when we grasp it, there is no higher place left for us to strive to reach. We have arrived at the summit of being. The metaphysics of form and matter assures this. The same metaphysics also assures that practical wisdom cannot be taught. That is because it concerns particulars, of which in Aristotle's view there is perception, but not knowledge. A practically wise man or woman simply sees what is right in a given situation. Only those who are virtuous have such perception. Their virtues are traits of character. A proper upbringing produces these traits, which alone make possible the moral discernment that distinguishes those with practical wisdom from the merely clever. But there is no science of practical wisdom. There is no organized body of knowledge that can instruct us how to apply the principles of virtue in any particular setting. Though it is possible to acquire practical wisdom through a process of training that welds pleasure to proper behavior, it is impossible to achieve the same goal by means of didactic instruction. The equation of intelligibility with form guarantees that particularity in general, and therefore, a fortiori, the sort of particularity that is relevant to our ethical and political deliberations, is something of which no one can ever have a teachable knowledge. To understand what the modern research ideal means for the pursuit of both theoretical and practical wisdom, as Aristotle understood these concepts, it is essential to grasp its relation to the metaphysics of form and matter. Aristotle's account of both sorts of wisdom is based on this metaphysics. By contrast, the whole of modern science and the research ideal, which is at once its instrument and expression, rests on the disillusion of the distinction between form and matter. This represents a profound revolution in thought. But in the first instance, it is not the result of changing scientific ideas. To begin with, it is the result of a shift in theological belief. The doctrine of creation, the most basic teaching of all the Abrahamic religions, compels those who embrace it to regard the world as infinitely intelligible. A creator, unlike a craftsman, is not hostage to the imperfections of the material on which he works. There is no such material. He brings the world into being from nothing. Hence, there is nothing to impede or limit the operation of his divine mind. The world must therefore be minded all the way down to the very hairs on our heads, as the gospel says. And because everything in the world is informed by the divine intelligence that calls it into being, the metaphysical distinction between form and matter can no longer be sustained, except as a useful fiction. It follows that the individuality of things, and not merely their general shape, must now in principle be accessible. In principle be accessible to the inquiring mind. The shift from Aristotle's God of inherent form to the creator God of Genesis thus opens the way to the belief that there is no limit to the intelligibility of the world and lays the ground in every branch of human inquiry for the supreme authority of what Leibniz calls the principle of sufficient reason. If the world is intelligible down to its smallest details, then there must be a reason why each thing is as it is. In any particular case, we may not yet know the reason, and our limitations guarantee that we will never know all the reasons why everything is as it is, but the way is now open to an endless process of further exploration that seeks to unpack, bit by bit, the order of a world whose intelligibility is boundless, though no finite being such as we can ever exhaust it. This is the metaphysical premise of the research ideal. By dissolving the distinction between form and matter, the theological shift from paganism to Abrahamism prepares the way for this ideal. But it simultaneously undermines the foundations of both theoretical and practical wisdom, as Aristotle conceived them, for in the absence of the distinction between form and matter, his conception no longer makes sense. On the one hand, it now becomes quite literally absurd to think that with sufficient time and effort, one can attain the perfect understanding of things that Aristotle still thought possible. If the world is infinitely intelligible, no one can ever get his or her, no human being at least, can ever get his or her mind around it all. Aristotle's ideal of theoretical wisdom falls to the ground. It is no longer even sane to seek the kind of contemplative wisdom he held up as the noblest state a human being can achieve, or to maintain that such wisdom can be taught by philosophers who already possess it. At the same time, the belief that practical wisdom is a kind of perception that cannot be taught because it concerns particulars collapses as well. At any given moment, our knowledge of the particulars that affect our moral and political choices is necessarily limited. But it is a real knowledge that grows with time and may rightly aspire to be as rigorous as any branch of human understanding. There is a genuine science of ethics, which we are slowly constructing. As a result, we no longer need to rely on virtue, and therefore on habit and character, as a foundation for correct judgment in the field of action. Practical wisdom, in Aristotle's sense, ceases to be the key to sound deliberation and is replaced by scientific methods instead, by economics, for example, and statistics, and more recently by cognitive science. Our universities have, I'm sure, an intellectual responsibility to support these disciplines. Perhaps they even have a moral duty to do so, but it is increasingly implausible to think that the promotion of ever more scientific methods of decision-making has anything at all to do with the cultivation of practical wisdom, as Aristotle understood it. To summarize, Aristotle's account of theoretical and practical wisdom rests on the presumed meaningfulness of a distinction between form and matter, which the creationist theology of the Abrahamic religions destroys. The destruction of this distinction leads to the idea of a world that is infinitely intelligible, and with that, to the modern research ideal, which simultaneously undermines the possibility of contemplative fulfillment in the realm of theory and the need to rely on character and habit in the field of practical action. Of course, one may attempt to rescue the spiritual value of the research ideal, which renders both sorts of wisdom moot, by insisting that it is our way of thanking God for the gift of an endlessly intelligible world, by treating research as a vocation in the old-fashioned sense of the word, so that even if the classical foundations of theoretical and practical wisdom have now been irretrievably destroyed, it is possible to believe that something of even greater value survives. This seems to have been, for example, the view of James Clerk Maxwell, the great 19th century Scottish physicist. But the problem with this argument is that the very theology that gave rise to the modern research ideal in the first place cannot be sustained in the teeth of the ideal's own demands and must eventually be discarded as another of those childish superstitions which the principle of sufficient reason will not allow thinking adults to retain, as Darwin courageously argued. Our situation then is this, as I see it. We live and work in universities dominated by the research ideal. Whatever else our universities do, they do for the sake of this. But the research ideal renders unintelligible the meaning of both theoretical and practical wisdom, as Aristotle understood them. It also swallows the revelation that inspired its own birth and reduces the idea of a God beyond the world whose mind we can never know to the status of a myth, utterly incompatible with the relentless rationalism of the research ideal itself. Those who affirm that wisdom still has a place in our universities and can in some sense be taught, therefore have an obligation to explain how the wisdom they have in mind differs from the two sorts that Aristotle describes and from the love of God, which, though still alive in many hearts, can never be regarded as anything but a private belief at war with the remorseless demands of science when viewed from the vantage point of the research ideal and of the universities founded upon it. This is a very tall order, to put it mildly. One may be more or less confident about anyone's chances of filling it. But one thing at least seems to me crystal clear. We have come to our present situation by a long and twisting path that leads from Aristotle to Leibniz and beyond, and no one can possibly form a responsible view of it, let alone be in a position to offer or advance or criticize views about the prospects for teaching wisdom in the universities of the 21st century without some understanding of the battle of ideas that have brought us to the world we inhabit. And that, I think, is a good and sufficient reason to affirm the continuing importance of the kind of undergraduate education increasingly unfashionable on many of our campuses that puts the study of the West and its greatest works at the center of a sustained and wholly unembarrassed attention. For while the West may not be a better place than any other, I hardly know what such a claim would even mean. It is where the questions I have been discussing tonight first assumed the shape they now display in every corner of the world. This will not save anyone, but it may perhaps help some to better understand the universities in which it is now the fate of all of us to work and study and learn. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Tom Hibbs, too, for his generous introduction and to say how delighted I am to be back at Baylor. It's horrifying to me to think of how many years ago it was that I was here last. at the invitation of the Honors College, but I remember it as a great pleasure. I think it was about 104 degrees or something like that when I was here last, so things are a little different this time, but it's a pleasure to be back in what actually looks like familiar territory. If you were expecting a sort of Rick Perry versus Mitt Romney debate here tonight, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, because I think that in spirit, much of what I have to say is pretty consonant with what Professor Kronman has said, although there will be a difference in style, because I have a relatively informal set of remarks to make, and my focus will be different. It'll be more on the contemporary university, partly by necessity, because I don't have the erudition in the classical texts that you've just heard so marvelously exemplified. I must say that I usually expect to be the sort of darkest Jeremiah in the room, and I find it, I'm not sure yet, but I think I might be slightly more optimistic than Professor Kronman about the prospects for teaching or supporting or nurturing wisdom in some sense in the modern university. So let me try to speak in a way that won't be too rambling or disconnected from my notes, and I hope it'll be somewhat responsive to what you've heard, and then we can have some discussion. When I was mulling over the key word of this conference, namely wisdom, it struck me that it provides both opportunities and problems, which might perhaps turn out to be the same thing. I don't think there's much controversy over the assertion that over the modern history of the university, as was implicit in Professor Kronman's remarks, there has been a radical breakdown of consensus about what such a word means. And the response to that breakdown, which I think mirrors a process in our larger society, has been to move most discussion of it out of the public square, as it is sometimes called, or the commons, and leave it aside as a matter of private conscience. Such a move tends to vitiate, or at least weaken, the possibility of community, or at least it shrinks the range of values that an academic community can be built around. If there's this sort of elephant in the room subject that we're not prepared to talk about with each other, then we talk about other things. Academic freedom is a value, for instance, that academics are pretty quick to agree about. But that's about where it begins and ends in most of the institutions that I know much about. Now, before I go into a full or even half-fledged lamentation mode, I want to say something possibly a little cantankerous or contrarian, and that is that there might be some good things about the breakdown of consensus over the meaning of such a word as wisdom. I think of, it's not exactly a cognate word, but it's a related word. It came up in Professor Kronman's presentation a few times, namely the word character. Sounds like a good thing that we should all be interested in building, nurturing. But in fact, it's a word that has a complicated history and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people according to how they use it. I ran across, for instance, not long ago, a statement by the Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis, which he made at his installation as Chancellor of the University of Guyana, in which he lauded character as the determination, and I quote, to practice the same thing over and over again while others are enjoying themselves. to push oneself from the easy part to the hard part, to listen to criticism and use it to reject one's own work and try again. Now, those are good qualities. I think one could say that that definition of character is more or less synonymous with stamina, right? So that's one understanding of what building character would mean. Sometimes, in fact, not so long ago in the history of educational discourse in our country, the word character actually was a thinly disguised term of discrimination between the model Protestant gentleman and the putatively grasping parvenu, in particular the importunate Jew who was seen by many of our educational leaders as knocking on the college door and trying to get into institutions where he didn't belong. So, for instance, the president of Harvard University, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, early in the 20th century, proposed a personal estimate of character on the part of the admissions authorities, quite explicitly in order to control what he called the dangerous increase in the proportion of Jews at Harvard. This was a time when the top floor of one of the Harvard dormitories became unaffectionately known as Kike's Peak, because it's where many of the Jewish students tended to live. Even in the absence of this kind of overt bigotry, and it's quite startling, and I think it's actually worthwhile to be startled by this sort of thing, to realize the sorts of things that leading figures in our society were once willing to say in public. And this is just one example of the sorts of things that some people may still believe these things in private, but very few are prepared to say them in public. But even in the absence of this sort of overt bigotry, judgments of character, which I'm using as a word that carries an implication of wisdom, tend, I think, to boil down to how comfortable the judge feels in the presence of the judged. Most people regard other people as being wise or of good character if they seem a lot like oneself. In response to President Lowell's suggestion, Judge Learned Hand wrote a famous letter to him as a Harvard alumnus, in which he said, "If anyone could devise an honest test for character, perhaps it would serve well. I doubt its feasibility except to detect formal and obvious delinquencies. Short of it, it seems to me that students can only be chosen by tests of scholarship, unsatisfactory as those no doubt are." In other words, we should stop trying to measure their wisdom, and we should let them in if they show intellectual power, whatever their ethnicity or origin might be. Now, having said that by way of a sort of proviso or caveat, I'm sure we all of us in this room, and I certainly do, believe that despite its history of misuse and abuse, there is something worth conserving in the claim, as Cardinal Newman put it, that education implies an action upon our mental nature and the formation of a character. Any true university, more than brain training for this or that functional task, should be concerned with such matters as character and wisdom. Although we may no longer agree, we don't. We, in the large sense, we no longer agree on the attributes of virtue or wisdom as, say, codified in biblical commandments or in Enlightenment precepts. Students, we know, still come to college not yet fully formed as social beings, and I believe they can still be deterred from sheer self-interest toward a life of enlarged sympathy for other people and a sense of civic responsibility. And it seems to me that, from my understanding, that those qualities have something to do with wisdom. This is not a Christian idea, certainly not exclusively so. This idea that the aim of education includes fostering ethical as well as analytical intelligence long predates the churches from which our earliest American colleges arose, and it's older than Christianity itself. In the Beit Midrash of ancient Judaism, typically located physically as well as spiritually near the synagogue, students prayed for insight and clarity of mind before embarking on the day's Torah study. To join Plato's Academy in Athens of the 4th century BCE was to acknowledge, and I quote from a scholarly description of the matter, "a change of heart and the adoption of a new way of life via a process akin to our own understanding of religious conversion. In first century Rome, in Seneca's famous letter on liberal education, we find a measured yet passionate account of the power of such an education to clear the mind of cant by inviting it to rise above the palaver of everyday life, as well as above pedantry. You'll recall, many of you I'm sure, this wonderful passage. We have no leisure to hear lectures on the question of whether Odysseus was sea-tossed between Italy and Sicily or outside our known world. We ourselves encounter storms of the spirit which toss us daily, and our depravity drives us into all the ills which troubled Odysseus. Show me rather by his example how I am to love my country, my wife, my father, and how, even after suffering shipwreck, I'm to sail toward these ends honorable as they are. Why try to discover whether Penelope was a pattern of purity or whether she had the laugh on her contemporaries, or whether she suspected that the man in her presence was her husband before she knew it was he? Teach me rather what purity is, and how great a good we have in it, and whether it is situated in the body or in the soul. Now, I think what is on our minds here, and I think what Professor Kronman was reminding us, I know part of what he was reminding me anyway, is that these sorts of questions, this way of thinking about the value of literary study or historical study, has been tending to drop out of the university, or at least to be shifted away from and marginalized from the center. And we could talk some about when that started to happen. Professor Kronman's genealogy of what he calls the research ideal goes back a very long way. We can pick our favorite starting point. I'm a little bit of a provincial historian of American culture, so I don't go back that far, but I would say that by the middle of the 20th century, I mean, it's really quite clear, and I'll say some things about that in a few minutes, that it was already taking over by the end of the 19th century. But by the middle of the 20th century, the ballgame was more or less over from the point of view of certain observers of the American university. So, for instance, in famous book called The Academic Revolution by Christopher Jenks and David Reisman, they made the point, and I quote, that moral and political questions that cannot be resolved by research and do not yield to cooperative investigation are almost by definition outside the academic orbit. So they were saying almost 50 years ago essentially what Professor Kronman has said tonight, and said so eloquently in his book, Education's End. And by the way, from my point of view, to say that somebody is saying something that was said before is not a denigration, because I think most truthful things have been said before. It's a question of restating them and bringing them back to life for new audiences. Now, I take it that we're here to sort of assess where we are in relation to this state of affairs, which varies, no doubt, from campus to campus. I mean, it will feel different here at Baylor than it does at Yale or NYU or at Columbia. But it's safe to say, I think, there's a general sense that what Jenks and Reisman were talking about has become only more the case. One of the symptoms of that sense, I think, institutionally speaking, is that many of our institutions have created such institutions within themselves as the Center for Human Values, for instance, at Princeton, or the Institute for Ethics at Duke. And these are very laudable initiatives, but they raise for me the question, what does it mean that thinking about ethics or wisdom seems to have become an extracurricular activity? There's a place you go if you have ethical questions on your mind, because they're not really legitimately within the province of what's going on in the classroom. A more recent statement, more openly in a mode of lamentation, which I think actually boils down to a sort of crude reductionist version of what Professor Kronman wrote about in his book, comes from the former dean of the college at Harvard, Harry Lewis, who points out quite rightly that many academic institutions affect horror that students attend college in the hope of becoming financially successful, but they offer students neither a coherent view of the point of a college education nor any guidance on how they might discover for themselves some larger purpose in life. So I assume what we're here to talk about, and here's where I want to try to shift into a slightly more upbeat mode, is how some concern with ethical questions, with the problem of what is wisdom and how do we know it when we see it and how do we nurture it, might still be part of the university culture. Now, as Professor Kronman points out, the most conspicuous feature of modern academic culture clearly is the rise of science. It's hard, we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that. I mean, you can see it reflected in the budgets, you can see it reflected in the majors to which students are going, and as he suggested, it has profound epistemological implications about what these institutions are all about. It is committed to what I would call, in perhaps to simplistic terms, a progressive theory of knowledge. I like to quote some of the presidents of the first full-fledged American research universities. For instance, the inaugural president of Johns Hopkins, Daniel Coit Gilman, defined not just the research mission, but the teaching purpose of the new university as showing students, and I quote, how to extend, even by minute accretions, the realm of knowledge. This is what we were hearing about. How to take further steps toward achieving that unattainable perfectibility of understanding of the natural world. Charles W. Eliot, the first president of Harvard, who didn't come from a divinity background, who was a chemist, put it this way: among the most important functions of universities is to store up the accumulated knowledge of the race, by which he meant the human race, so that each successive generation of youth shall start with all the advantages which their predecessors have won. I call that the relay race theory of knowledge, in which no runner ever has to travel over trodden ground. Now, there's been some expression of anxiety about the takeover by this principle of university culture, and I share that anxiety, and I feel besieged and beleaguered just like every other practitioner of the humanities does at the present time. But I think we want to acknowledge that it's in fact a very powerful idea that has, there's a reason why it has been so successful. I mean, it explains, for instance, why a bright high school graduate coming into Baylor or Columbia or any other institution probably has mastered at least the elementary principles of the calculus, whereas in the 17th century, when our first institutions in this country of higher education were founded, there were only two people in the world who had any clue about the calculus, namely Leibniz and Newton. So, you know, that doesn't mean that the bright 16-year-old today is intellectually comparable to Leibniz and Newton, but it does mean that certain kinds of knowledge can be transmitted and handed down to the next generation without having to be rediscovered and reinvented. And that is a powerful, extraordinary achievement, which I think has a lot to do with the significance of Western culture in the world, and indeed the domination by Western culture of the world of the last several centuries. It explains, for instance, why a third or fourth year medical student today will know more about the genetic basis of disease or the management of organ transplantation than the most decorated senior physicians knew 30 or 40 years ago. Now, moral knowledge, or what we're calling for shorthand terms wisdom, doesn't seem to conform to this structure. Unless perhaps we might persuade ourselves that wisdom has something to do with accumulating experience. But if we think about transmitting or teaching wisdom in an academic context, we can't think about it in the same way as these other subjects. The way I like to illustrate this point, you know, Albert Camus' novel, The Plague of 1947, or Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year of 1720-something, don't tell us more about the social consequences of pestilence than Thucydides did in his passages about the plague at Athens in the 5th century BCE. So the idea of progressive knowledge doesn't work in this realm. So where then, if, as Professor Kronman says, and I fully agree, the study of such books as the ones I've just mentioned seem to be somewhat on the ropes in most institutions. They haven't disappeared, and there's some pretty tenacious people keeping it going at many institutions, including this one and the ones that we represent. But let me be a little maybe fuzzy-minded or generous-minded for a couple of minutes and look at some other repositories of what we might think of as wisdom in the university in order to maybe cheer ourselves up a little bit. I want to make the case that we shouldn't shortchange the scientists. The good scientists that I know take considerable umbrage, I don't mean to say that that was what was being said earlier, but take considerable umbrage when what they do is confused with the production of new technologies. That is, great scientists work out of a sense of love of the incredible, dazzling complexity of the natural world of nature itself. They work with a sense of reverence, which in many cases I think runs quite close to a sense of spiritual reverence. They have a lot of humility in view of their understanding of the severe limits of what they know and the vastness of what they don't know. And in the ideal, at least, the scientific world works as a genuine, open society where people are interested in a collective enterprise and share knowledge with one another and test one another's propositions, sometimes out of envy, I suppose, and sometimes hoping that the other guy's experiment will prove to be fraudulent, but sometimes too with the excitement and delight that new insights have been attained into subjects that had been previously lying in darkness. So I think we ought to grant our colleagues in the sciences, and there may be some, and many in this room for all I know, that they're not shut out from the sphere of wisdom, and that there's a lot of wisdom in the practice of science at its best. I also like to think that there's a certain kind of wisdom that can arise from what might be called the processes or the dynamics of the classroom, even if the subject matter is entirely secular and is in itself not directly connected to the topics that we're addressing tonight. That is, in a good classroom led by a skilled teacher, students learn how to qualify their initial responses to hard questions. They learn the difference between informed insights and mere opinionating. It can provide the pleasurable chastisement of discovering that others see the world differently from them, and that their experience is not replicable by or even reconcilable with one's own. In other words, at its best, a class, when it works well, and this is why I'm a big believer in small classes, although I think lecturing has its place. I hope you won't be persuaded tonight that lecturing has no place. But that a small class can be an exercise in deliberative democracy, and Lord knows we need all the practice we can get these days in what deliberative democracy looks like and feels like, in which the teacher is neither oracle nor lawgiver, but a kind of provocateur who gets the discussion going and helps students to understand what a civil discussion actually looks and feels like. I actually think that there is wisdom to be gained from college athletics. Now, that might surprise you, coming from me, from my particular neck of the woods, and I'm well aware of all the really lamentable abuses that it's easy to point out in the world of college athletics, and I think you guys are a little bit connected to that issue at the moment, as your football conference is having its issues, right? But we don't need to talk about it. We can talk about that tonight if you want to. But some of the wisest students I know are the college athletes, who I often think are the last student group that people feel free to denigrate. The last student minority group that people feel free to denigrate for their group characteristics. But student athletes can gain wisdom about the contingency of life, about the inevitability of failure, about the virtue of humility in victory, and about the obligation to their fellow human beings. And I think when it works, it works well. I'm partial, of course, to the study of the humanities in this connection. I think that the study of history, one of the great values of the study of history, if it's done properly, is that it can be an antidote to pride. It provokes questions as we study the past, such as, if we had been in that situation, would we have made the choices that from our retrospective point of view seem to us to be right? So my own current research interest is in the period just before the Civil War in the United States, when people of good conscience in all regions of the country were trying to figure out what were their ethical responsibilities with regard to the problem of slavery. Was abolitionism, immediate emancipation, the only morally defensible response to the situation? Was there some middle way between the defense of slavery and the demand that slavery be eradicated immediately, gradual, compensated emancipation, colonization, which to us, from the vantage point of 2011, looks like what we would call ethnic cleansing, but it didn't look to a lot of Americans that way then. And by studying a historical period like that and trying to get inside the minds of figures like Abraham Lincoln, who after all began his presidency as an anti-slavery man, but not as an abolitionist, and who pledged in his first inaugural address that he would support the fugitive slave law and ensure that law was enforced. By studying history and getting inside the minds of people like that, I think we can gain some wisdom about our own limitations and some humility as we ask ourselves the question, what will future generations say about us? What were our moral failings? What obvious truths that will seem conspicuous to our successors did we miss? Now, we've been talking largely, if not mainly, about discontinuity in the history of in intellectual history and in the history of the institutions that we work in. And I want to move toward a conclusion by talking about some continuities. I often try to remind my students that there is a certain line that runs from the preacher to the teacher, and that the very term that was used in the introductions tonight, professor, after all, is a term that derives from the notion of a faith community in which one professes a faith. So whether we like it or not, we have inherited that tradition, and we're still, in some ways, beholden to it. Now, in the mostly post-theistic academic world that at least Tony and I inhabit, those kinds of assumptions often seem remote and possibly bizarre to my colleagues and to some of our students. And one way I try to address this question, and I'll try it out on you tonight for just a brief couple of minutes before wrapping it up, is I put it this way. I said, look, every teacher, every real teacher knows that, yes, there's the teacher and there's the student, but there's a third force in the room, a mysterious third force in the room, which sometimes will act on the mind of the student in a way that wakes him or her up to a new insight, or maybe even a whole new way of thinking about his or her life. And sometimes nothing will happen. You can give the best lecture you've ever given. You can ask the most provocative questions you've ever asked, and some of the students in the room will stare at you like, you know, what time is it? And somebody in the back row who maybe hasn't said anything for the whole semester will have an experience, and will come up to you afterwards, or will come to your office hours and want to go further into the subject at hand. Now, the theological word for this inaudible and invisible force is grace. In my institution, there are not a lot of students who come from a background where the term grace has played much of a role in their lives, although there are some, surprisingly enough. So I find myself with the challenge of having, when I lecture on Puritanism, for instance, in my course on American literature, I find myself with the challenge of trying to explain to my students what did they mean by this concept. And this is the analogy that I try out on them. I'm sure it's defective in lots of ways, but let me try it out on you. Imagine that two college roommates go out one evening to see a production of King Lear. As you all know, a play about an old man cruelly duped by his own children, who's losing his grip on power and dignity and even his own senses, and ends up wandering alone under the open sky without shelter or mercy or hope. So these two roommates go and see a local production of the play, and when it's done, they come out of the theater, and one of them says to the other, you know, that was really kind of a waste of time. Let's go get a beer. I don't know what the big deal is. That old guy really had it coming to him. He was an unbearable whiner. I didn't want to listen to him any longer. Meanwhile, the other young man has had a devastating experience. He doesn't know why, he doesn't know how, but he finds himself thinking about his own father, about the obligations of children to parents, and for that matter, parents to children, about the savage sadness that comes upon many people in their broken old age. In fact, he finds himself thinking about every aspect of his life in a new way. Does he want to have children of his own? If so, how will he bring them up? Maybe he thinks about becoming a physician. Or maybe he just wants to call home to see how his father is doing, with whom he's had a difficult relationship. Or more likely, he doesn't know what to do, but he feels a sudden conviction that his plans and priorities need to be revisited and revised. One thing he knows for sure is that he doesn't want to end up like Lear, wandering alone on the heath. In short, the world has been transformed for him while it remains utterly unchanged for his friend. And yet, they've heard the same voices and words, seen the same bodies and props moving about on the same stage, or to put it in mechanistic terms, they've experienced the same oral and visual stimuli. I think it is impossible to say why something so important has happened to one of these young men and not to the other. Their SAT scores may be identical. In fact, the one whom the play leaves unmoved may have higher scores and better grades and better prospects to make the dean's list. The difference between them is immeasurable by any testing instrument, and it has nothing to do with which one has studied harder for tomorrow's exam on Elizabethan drama. Many of us who work in education today have no language to account for this mystery, we might say, of why one of them takes a step toward wisdom and the other doesn't. We have no language for the mystery, but that doesn't mean that the mystery doesn't exist. My point is that that can happen. It can happen in a lecture, it can happen in a discussion, it can happen in a theatrical performance, and maybe it's a kind of wisdom to know that we control very little of what we do, and that includes our efforts to define and grasp wisdom for ourselves or to impart it to others. Thanks very much.
Thanks to both of you for wonderful, stimulating talks. We're happy to take some questions now. Got microphones here and here. Please come forward.
Hi, I'm Dan Sportello from University of Notre Dame, where I'm a grad student in philosophy. My question is for Professor Kronman. I was very puzzled by some of what you said about the relationship between the pagan Aristotelian philosophy and Christian philosophy. The first passage that came to my mind, which admittedly may be a misremembering, is when Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles says that although what you said is true, although God is, as creator, has perfect knowledge of individuals, of course this knowledge doesn't extend to us, right? So for Golden Age scholasticism, at least, we're stuck in the Aristotelian paradigm where we only have knowledge of universals, not of particulars. And it struck me also then that the scientific revolution follows only when the very doubt about the intelligibility of anything at all becomes very strong, right? It's not the perfect knowability of the cosmos, but the radical unknowability of the cosmos that seems to preoccupy people in the immediately before the scientific revolution. It may be that, you know, I'm from much further north in my education, maybe totally wrong, I don't know, but.
Great, thank you. The thought that the world is this on? Can you hear me? Yep. The thought that the world is endlessly complex and knowable in its complexity, though we are obviously limited ourselves and will never get our minds around it all. That is not a thought that has a home in Aristotle's philosophy. The highest sort of knowledge that Aristotle could conceive was complete and perfect in itself. You could, if you had a gift for metaphysics and the leisure to pursue it, you could reach a point at which you would say or know that you had exhausted the intelligibility of the world in your own mind, and there was nothing more to be done than to enjoy for as long as you were able, until your stomach began to growl or your eyelids fluttered, to enjoy that consummating wisdom that you had achieved. The idea of a consummating wisdom of that kind goes out the window with the thought, the proposition, that the world isn't intelligible only up to a certain point. It isn't finitely intelligible. If that were true, then a finite mind would have a shot at getting a hold of it, but infinitely so, in which case it's just not in the cards that we'll ever grasp it all. That is the disappointment and encouragement. That's the, if I can put it this way, it's the disappointment and the ecstasy which combine in the research ideal. The thought that, gosh, we'll never reach the summit. But on the other hand, there's always more work to be done. And every step we take shines the light on another little piece of the dark world. And what a joy that is. Which is a segue to, gives me an opportunity to emphasize, underscore something that Andy said, which I agree with emphatically, and that is that those who are devoted as teachers and students to the research ideal, who derive their deepest personal satisfactions from the sense of participation in an ongoing, endless process of discovery, and who define themselves in terms of the contribution they make, that the evanescent contribution they make to that endless task, are engaged in something wonderful. I would say reverentially wonderful, and scientists speak about it. Many of them, thoughtful ones, do in these terms. There is an experience of joy which lies at the very heart of the practice of modern research that I, for a minute, wouldn't want to deny or denigrate or want to push to one side. It is an essential component of the spiritual life of modern teachers and students. But I would say this. This is how I've come to think about it. Both as teachers and students, we live two different kinds of lives. One is the life of a participant in this endless venture, collaborative venture of, bringing the world by small incremental degrees within the domain of the understood. And in that respect, we are just, we are passing little blips in an ongoing adventure, and we really don't matter very much individually, personally, to the enterprise. We make a contribution and expect it to be eclipsed the next day, and we go on our way and disappear from the stage of research. But we are also simultaneously human beings who are living lives that are conditioned by the same mortal questions, that are shaped by the same existential predicament, if I can put it that way, as the life of every human being ever has been and always will be. In that sense, we're not participants in a progressive venture that has a history in which our part one day will be lost and forgotten. We are living again from the start that same old, eternally repeated human drama, and we've got to find our bearings in that capacity too. And it is just as it is essential that our colleges and universities provide an opportunity for their teachers and students to engage productively in the advancement of knowledge in whatever field they happen to be working in. It is also important, desperately important, that they provide an opportunity for students and faculty to come to terms as best they can with their perennial humanity. And one way to do that, I think for me it has been, in my professional career, the most satisfying way, is to sit down with a group of students and pick up an old book written a very long time ago in different circumstances by another human being who confronted the perennial questions and had something of deep interest to say about it, and to encourage, to develop, to sustain the habit of slowing down in the progressive race to an ever more exhaustive and perfect, although never completely exhaustive and perfect, knowledge of the world, to slow down and take time to notice your old humanity, which is really no different than the humanity of Homer or Melville or Einstein, for that matter, and that experience is a helpful counterweight to the prideful thought, which the research ideal, with all of its discouragements, can promote, that I'm better than my ancestors, predecessors, because I know more than they did. Of course, the graduate student who's working on a PhD under my supervision will know more than me, and so this sense of prideful mastery is pretty short-lived. But reading an old book in the company of a few friends, other students and a teacher in a classroom, is one way to hold on to that second persona, the unchanging persona, which you inhabit just as completely as you do the progressive one, which is also a source of joy and satisfaction.
I have a question, I guess, about reason and kind of confidence in reason. And some different scholars in recent years Christian scholars have commented that whereas in the past Christianity was sort of seen as holding back reason and like the Galileo type thing, and that now in a way things have flipped, and in many places it's the Christians who are saying we need to do reason, and it's others or secular thinkers who don't think reason really works anymore and don't have confidence in it. And I'm thinking of people like Stanley Hauerwas or Pope John Paul II in Faith and Reason. And I wonder if, I don't know if you're going to have any, if you see this, or if maybe you see this in other people that you're reading or writing about. And also the question would be, how did that happen, and if it is happening?
I don't know that I have anything useful, much less penetrating, to say about it. It's a very good question. I just really do agree with your observation that one of the things we've been living through is the collapse of, if I could put it this way, the collapse of faith in reason on the part of secular intellectuals in the last 30 or 40 years. I tend to think that these things are cyclical. You know, middle of the 20th century, for instance, in the wake of the horrific events that surely called into question the idea of progress, right? I mean, the 20th century being the century of antibiotics and space flight and high-speed computing, and also the century of the Gulag and the Holocaust, it was a little hard to tell the story of the relentless advancement of mankind. But in the wake of those events in the middle of the 20th century, you get a kind of universalist ethos, right? As expressed in the Charter of the United Nations, for example, as expressed in a book that my parents' generation, everybody had it on their bookshelf, called The Family of Man. Some of you know that book. Organized with beautiful photographs of all the stages of life, from birth to death, and illustrating those stages with pictures of human beings from every culture in the world and every color and every continent, with the implication that there were commonalities. And then in the later decades of the 20th century, for reasons that I'm not at this hour of the evening without having a glass of wine before the occasion, couldn't possibly wrap my mind around. But in the later decades of the 20th century, all of that went out the window, and the notion of reason was undermined, the notion of universals was undermined, and we found ourselves in the sort of delighting in the carnival of difference, is the phrase that pops into my mind. I think that party is sort of winding down again, and that humanists, the ones I know, younger humanists, are beginning to come back to their faith in reason and beginning to become interested again in universals. Why that's happening now, whether it's just, one explanation would be the sort of Harold Bloomian explanation that every generation finds itself by resisting and overthrowing its predecessors. So whatever the orthodoxy was in the last generation will be overturned by the next one. So now we're overturning the orthodoxies of postmodernism, and that's okay with me. So that's about the best I can do with your comment. As to Christian thinkers coming back to reason, somebody else would have to speak to that point, but I think I know what you mean.
This question was occasioned by some remarks by Professor Delbanco, but I'd be interested in what both of you have to say in response to it. Professor Hibbs said we're allowed to have a brief preface, and I'd like to take advantage of that right, but I'd like to put the preface after the question, because I think it'll be more useful if you know the question it's leading up to. The question is, it seems to me that there is a sort of presupposition in both of your remarks that the best hope for the kind of communication of wisdom we're aspiring to is the university. And for all the modern research university may provide a sort of inhospitable environment, it's still the best chance we have. And yet, so my question is, might we be underestimating the possibilities for work outside the university? Because it's surely the case that too is an inhospitable environment, but there are possibilities there too. And what provoked this, this is the preface, was the invocation of these sort of Aristotelian ideas. Sort of Aristotle would certainly agree that on the sports field we can learn things about life and important lessons. But that's true surely on the sports field for the professional athlete or the amateur athlete outside of an academic context. And similarly, while it's true that we can't say for sure why one student responds to King Lear in a profound way while another is utterly unresponsive, we do know in a general way one reason why it's often the case students don't respond, which is that they're 18 years old. And that there are a time of their life where some of the literature which contains wisdom we want to pass on simply doesn't connect with experiences that they recognize. And there are some people who at 18 won't get it, who might well get it at some later point. And of course we're very aware that for most of the students we have, after they graduate, that's going to be their last experience of formal education which isn't vocationally oriented. And it felt to me that there might be the presupposition that we have to do it now because there won't be the opportunities after later on. Do you think that's true, or do you have more hope than it sounded like you had about what goes on outside the university?
Well, I think it's a great set of comments and questions that I will. My way of evading it would be to say, to reiterate what Tom Hibbs said. I just accepted the assignment, which was to talk about the place of wisdom in the 21st century university, and I was not assigned the question of whether the 21st century university matters anymore, right?
That's next week.
So we can have another conference about that. But and your question actually would be a very good theme for a conference, because I think there's no question about the fact that one of the challenges we all face as college teachers or university people or whatever we are is that the credibility of our institutions is on the down slope, which might be proportionally related to the expense of going to one of them. And the technologies that surround us are putting a lot of pressure on the idea that the stuff I was talking about, the classroom, the lecture, and all these forms that go back through the Middle Ages all the way back to the classical period may be on their last legs, and that more and more people will seek experience outside these categories. So I think everything you say is true and represents a very big challenge for us. At the same time, you know, one has a vocation, and one is lucky if one believes in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a vocation; it would be a job. And I still believe in what we do in universities, and I still believe that what we do can have powerful effects even on 18-year-olds. Maybe one reason for that, and it's something that Tony might have commented, and I won't go on much longer, is that I teach in a place, and we have some turbulence on our campus right now over these issues, where we've had the kind of curriculum that Tony was commending in place for almost 100 years. Great books, great Western classics curriculum for almost 100 years. For weird reasons, we've had this. And I'm continually impressed by how many alumni I meet of every age, from their late 20s to their 80s, who talk about those experiences that they had between ages 18 and 20, 21, really the first 2 years of college, reading those books in small classes with great teachers as absolutely the transformative experiences of their lives. And they've done a lot of other things since then out there in the world you were alluding to. So I'm agreeing with you. I think you've raised a very important matter, but at the same time, we got to keep doing this thing because it still matters.
Could I add just a brief comment? I think you've actually raised two good questions. One has to do with the relationship between what goes on in the classroom within the college or university and all of the other things that are happening in the lives of the 18 to 22-year-olds who are there in school. I'm thinking now principally about a residential program where the students are there full-time, living there, and spending some actually pretty small fraction of their hours in class and the rest of the time in the dining hall or on the sports field or in the dorm room. The second question is, what is the relationship of all that happens during that 4-year period to the rest of life, to what comes after it? You know, as to the first, I think I would say a couple of things. Neither very, novel or provocative. The first is that the very idea of a residential college experience is premised on the assumption that the value of it lies in many different dimensions and not just in the one that we think of as the as the educational component of it in the strictest and narrowest sense. The second thing I would say is, but granting that, the classroom does have a special place among all of the things that are happening in the lives of the students at such a college or university. Aristotle would say, the playing field in the dorm room is for the sake of the classroom, not the other way around. It has a certain natural priority, which isn't to say an exclusive one. It's not the whole. It's a piece, but it is an organizing center of things. So what happens in the classroom is especially important and kind of sets a tone, maybe, and can be an energizing center for all of the rest. As to the question of the college years and the rest of life, I think for many, most, nearly all college graduates, the value of that experience is only felt, appreciated, begins to ramify and become something of anchoring significance in the person's life, in the whole of their life. It isn't as if at the end of 4 years now you're equipped for living and you have a valuable experience under your belt and you're going to use it and make something of it and go on to the next stage of life. Its value only takes shape and appears and becomes valuable to you in the course of living, subject to pressures and in pursuit of opportunities which are very diverse and distracting in many ways, but which provide a field for the memory and the display of what you've done during those 4 years. It's awfully unusual, really. And one of my colleagues put it this way to me, and when he did it, I found it really quite startling. He said, "What an odd but wonderful way to organize a civilization. To say to your young people, just when they're reaching, approaching a peak of at least physical productivity, to say, okay, blow a whistle, time out, 4 years out of the game of life. Of course, you'll be thinking about careers and the rest of it, but we're going to give you 4 years of free space in which to play around and think about things and take some courses, and yeah, you're going to have to get your act together, but not right away." What a wasteful, wonderful expenditure, and how ultimately productive of that vague but not unimportant thing we call a meaningful life.
Last question.
My name is Douglas Henry. I'm from Baylor University. My question's for you, Professor Kronman. It's related to the first question that was asked. I think if your beautifully lucid presentation is ultimately to be persuasive, you can't take a shortcut around Thomas Aquinas. And the reason, of course, is because he's regarded as the great synthesizer of Aristotle and Christian doctrine. It is not, in his estimation, I think, we would see charitably the case that his theological convictions are an impediment to the intelligibility of the universe or an obstacle to wisdom, but the contrary. And so the puzzle is this, I think, that you've given us an unpalatable couple of choices. Either Aquinas, notwithstanding every evidence to the contrary, does not really understand Aristotle, or, on the other hand, again, every evidence to the contrary, he doesn't understand Christian doctrine. So he's either gotten Aristotle wrong or he doesn't understand the implications of his own faith correctly. If it's to be the case, as I understand you're arguing, that it is the theological idea here that gives rise to despair of the sort of wisdom that Aristotle at any rate hoped for. And so I wonder if you could help sort through who...
Say a word or two about Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, and what he gets right or
wonderful.
wrong.
Okay. I don't know that what I'll say will be at all satisfying to you or others in the audience who may have that and similar questions on their mind. I would just say this. Certainly, there was no inadequacy of understanding on Aquinas' part with respect either to the meaning and full consequences of Aristotle's philosophy or the meaning and full consequences of his Christian faith. He saw as far and as clearly into the depths of both as anyone who has ever lived. The question is whether he was able, I'm going to put it this way, I hope I don't give offense to anyone in the room, whether he was able to hold on to his Christian faith full strength as he followed Aristotle down the path of a pagan necessitarianism, which I think Aquinas was deeply attracted to, but could not give himself over to without putting himself at odds with his own God. But we would have to get down to the texts and look at them and talk about them in detail. But I think in the end, Aquinas' God comes dangerously close to being a God of reason who is inseparable from, and not just inseparable from, but indistinguishable from, the world which he necessarily creates. And it was that raised Orthodox eyebrows, as I'm sure you know, in the Paris of the late 13th century, and caused Aquinas to be regarded as a kind of soft-core fellow traveler of the hardcore paganizers in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences who were prepared to swallow Aristotle hook, line, and sinker, even if that meant saying goodbye once and for all to the God of Abraham. Aquinas was never prepared to say that and fought hard to protect his Christian scruples, but I think he was drawn so deeply in the direction of a, if I may call it this, describe it as an Abrahamized paganism. A paganism which equates God and the world, but views the God of the world as something infinitely deep and not merely finitely so, as Aristotle did. In other words, I read Aquinas as a closet Spinozist. But that, to make that case, we would have to go through the Summa Theologica question by question, and I'm sure you would have a lot to say in response.
And we'd need multiple bottles of wine for that conversation. Obviously, deep stuffer. I just want to say that one of the reasons I love being at Baylor is to have my Baptist colleagues defending Thomas Aquinas. So it's just a marvelous experience for me. And please, let's thank our two wonderful and gracious speakers.